Hey, welcome back. So the expressions we covered in the last video may not have seemed much different than something you would crunch out in a spreadsheet, or even on a piece of paper. We were essentially using Python as a glorified, supercharged calculator. But now it's time to get into more, programmery stuff. And maybe the best place to start is with variables. So that, of course, begs the question, what the heck are variables? Simply put, variables are like little named storage boxes for pieces of data. Data like the values we've been working with so far, such as numbers and text strings, for example. You simply give a variable a name, and then you can store a value of some kind, most any kind really, inside of it. Now, the great thing about variables is that you can define them once and then simply reference the variable name, not the exact value stored in it, in the rest of your code. This prevents you from needing to remember the exact value you stored in the variable every time you use it, which has the added benefit of ensuring that you don't accidentally use the wrong number somewhere in your code because you misremembered the original value. As you might imagine, this feature comes in especially handy when you need to reuse the same value multiple times in your code. Now, another incredibly useful feature of variables is that we can overwrite them with new values. After all, variables should be able to vary. This makes our programs more flexible since all we need to do is change the value of the variable in one place, and that new value automatically updates anywhere else the variable is referenced. Now, don't worry if you can't see the value of this just yet. It'll make more sense once we walk through some examples. So, how to create a variable in Python? It's actually super easy. All you have to do is give your variable a name, and then use the equal sign to assign it a value. In programmer speak, this is called declaring a variable. So for example, let's say you wanted to create a variable called myVar and store the number 10 inside of it. You would just write myVar equals 10, and boom, you've got yourself a variable. Okay, so that's enough slides for one video. Now let's get our hands dirty with some live code. So as usual, I'll go ahead and fire up our Python shell here. And now for our first example, here in the shell, I'll create a variable called myVar and assign it the value of 11. So I'll type my_var equals 11. So now that that variable is declared and holds that value of 11, I can use our old friend the print function to display the value stored in the variable. So I'll just say print myVar. And there we go. When we run that, we see the value stored in that variable. And it turns out that we actually don't even need the print function to display the value stored in that variable. Remember how I said, when we're working in the Python shell, that if we run code that returns a value, that value will automatically be displayed here in the shell? Well, if we simply type out the name of our variable, myVar, and then run that as code, we still get the value stored in that variable. So it turns out that simply executing the name of a variable as code is a kind of very simple expression. And the return value is just the value stored in that variable. And we'll be able to take advantage of this to circumvent using the print function every time we just want to test what value is stored in a variable. Also note, and this is one of the great things that variables bring to the table, that the value in that variable persists even after I've run a couple of additional lines of code after declaring the variable. Basically, Python remembers the value stored in that variable. And that's how we'll ultimately be able to use the same value in multiple different parts of our code just by referencing the associated variable name. Okay, now let's say we want to do something a little more interesting with variables. So for one thing, we can use them as inputs to expressions, just like we would with regular old values like numbers and text strings. For example, let's say we want to divide our myVar variable here by 2. So to do that, all I have to do is just type myVar, then a / and 2, and then run that. And as we would expect, we get 5.5. Now, of course, we can also use variables as inputs to text-based expressions. So let's create a variable called firstName that stores the string John. And by the way, you'll note that I always use an underscore to connect the words that make up the variable name if there are multiple words that make up the variable name. There's good reason for this that I won't get into in this video, but we'll cover that in depth in the next one. Okay, so back to our example. We'll say first_name equals John. Next up, we'll declare a variable called lastName that stores the string Doe. So now, if we want to combine those two variables to create a full name, we can do it like this. First, we reference the firstName variable, and then we'll concatenate a space to that, which will just be a space surrounded by quotes, and then we'll concatenate our lastName variable to that. Now running this, sure enough, we get John Doe. Now alternatively, we could even store this expression that we just crunched out in its own variable. So I could say full name equals, and then to save myself some typing, I'll just copy and paste that expression from a couple lines up. And now if I run this, John Doe should be stored in our full name variable, which we can verify by simply typing the name of that variable and hitting enter. And sure enough, it worked. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the values inside of variables can be changed or overwritten. So let's say we want to change the value of firstName from John to Jane. To do this, we can simply update the value of the variable, effectively overriding it. And doing that is as simple as just redeclaring the variable, which really just looks like declaring it for the first time. So I'll say firstName equals Jane. So now let's try running our full name expression again, which I'll do just by copying and pasting that code. So running that, now we get Jane Doe, because as of when this expression was crunched out by Python, the value stored in that firstName variable was Jane instead of John. Now before we go, it's important to note that Python is what's known as a dynamically typed language. This means that you don't have to specify what data type you want to store in a variable when you create it, which as it turns out is something you have to do in a lot of languages. Python, though, will just figure that out for you based on the value you assign to the variable. So for example, let's say we have a variable called dynamic and we want to store the string hello world inside of it. So I'll say dynamic equals hello world. But now let's say we want to change the value of dynamic from a string to a number. All we actually need to do here is just overwrite the variable like we did when we overwrote John with Jane. So I'll go ahead and do that by overwriting our current value in dynamic with 123.45. Easy peasy. We didn't have to do anything special to tell Python that we wanted to change the data type of our variable. It just figured that part out for us. However, it's important to note that changing the data type of a variable can cause problems if you're not careful. So let's say we want to see the updated value of our dynamic variable divided by 67. So if we crunch that out here in the shell, so far, so good. But now if we update dynamic's value to the string what's up Earth, and then try running that dynamic divided by 67 expression again, whoops, we get an error. And that's because we're now trying to divide a bunch of letters by a number, which doesn't make any sense, either to us or to Python. So this is just one example of how changing the type of data stored in a variable can result in unexpected issues. And as such, it's important to be mindful of the data types of your variables, especially if you're using them in expressions. All right. So tricky issues with changing data types aside, using variables turns out to be pretty daggone straightforward, at least in Python. But what's surprisingly not quite as straightforward as you'd expect is naming variables. That's right, just figuring out what name to give these little pieces of data. That topic actually deserves its own video, which as it happens is coming up next. I'll see you there.